The moral argument for God's existence is an argument that has been around for a long time and has been defended by a variety of Christian thinkers throughout history. C.S. Lewis is perhaps the most widely known proponent of this argument. It has taken on different formulations, but they all make the same conclusion. Objective morality is real because God is real. There is a moral law because there is a moral lawgiver. The formulation of this argument that I have defended in the previous video and in this one is the version most famously associated with the Christian philosopher Dr. William Lane Craig, and he talks about this in his books On Guard, Reasonable Faith, and Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview. It goes like this. 1. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. 2. Objective moral values and duties do exist. 3. Therefore, God exists. In the previous video, we looked at reasons to affirm the first premise. I gave arguments for thinking that moral realism would be false if God did not exist, and I addressed a few of the most common arguments against that. In this video, I will defend the second premise of the argument. If moral values and duties really do exist, then it means that God exists. And if both of the premises can be established, then that means the conclusion follows. Therefore, God exists. So fire up those neurons because we're about to use the brains that God gave us. As we saw in the previous video, objective moral values and duties cannot exist in the absence of God. But deep down, we all know that they do exist. As Dr. William Lane Craig wrote, quote, "Philosophers who reflect on our moral experience see no more reason to distrust that experience than the experience of our five senses. I believe what my five senses tell me, namely that there is a world of physical objects out there. My senses are not infallible, but that doesn't lead me to think that there is no external world around me. Similarly, in the absence of some reason to distrust my moral experience, I should accept what it tells me, namely that some things are objectively good or evil, right or wrong. Most of us would agree that in moral experience we do apprehend objective values and duties." End quote. This is known as the argument from moral intuition. It seems intuitively obvious that moral facts exist. Craig argues, and so do I, that knowledge of objective morality is a properly basic belief. In that case, we are within our rational rights to affirm that objective moral values and duties do in fact exist, unless and until a defeater comes along. So are there any good defeaters to our moral intuition? Non-moral realists certainly tend to think so. Let's see if their arguments hold. However, before we do, I want to point out that intuition is not the only argument there is for moral realism. Inspiring Philosophy lists 5 different arguments for the truth of moral realism over on his video, Moral Realism Defended, which is part of his series on meta-ethics. I strongly advise that you go watch his video at some point to see the other arguments for the truth of moral realism. Objection! Objection 1. People disagree on moral issues like abortion, homosexuality, and war, so our moral intuitions are unreliable guides. Perhaps the main argument I've heard against the reliability of our moral intuitions is that when it comes to moral issues like abortion, homosexuality, whether or not going to war is ever justified, and so on, there is much disagreement and debate. The moral anti-realist says that people's moral intuitions are telling them different things, and therefore our moral intuitions are unreliable guides in determining whether right and wrong really exist. And given that moral intuitions are unreliable guides in determining whether right and wrong really exist, we therefore cannot say for sure whether or not premise 2 is true. Indians believe cows are sacred and should never be killed for food, while Americans think it's all right to butcher cows for food. Many civilizations think cannibalism is evil and disgusting, but some primitive tribes engage with it with no problem. Do these moral disagreements indicate that we cannot trust our moral intuitions to affirm that right and wrong really exist? I don't think so. There is a parallel between our moral intuitions and our physical senses. We trust that the physical world is real because our senses tell us so. Our moral intuitions tell us that things are really right and really wrong. It seems to me that if this argument could be used against our moral intuitions, it could also be used against the intuition that our physical senses are giving us reliable information. After all, some people are colorblind, while others are not. But should that really cause us to doubt that colors like red, blue, yellow, green, and so on really exist? Should we doubt that colors exist just because there's a disagreement between the colorblind and those who perceive color? What about those who can perceive color yet disagree on a certain shade of color? Don't forget that whole internet sensation based on a meme called The Dress, in which people disagreed as to whether it was white and gold or black and blue. According to the moral relativist reasoning, these different conclusions on color should lead us to conclude that color is not an objective feature of reality. This is absurd. But if differing opinions on color do not render our physical sense of sight unreliable, why should differing opinions on moral issues render our moral intuitions unreliable? Moreover, more often than not, the disagreement is not on whether the thing in question is moral or immoral. Rather, the disagreement is over the facts surrounding the situation. For example, in the case of abortion, the issue isn't whether murder is really evil, or whether a woman has the right to do whatever she wants with her body. Rather, the issue is whether the unborn fetus is a living human being. Pro-lifers would argue that the unborn fetus is alive, and that abortion kills that living human. Pro-choicers, on the other hand, would argue that the unborn fetus is just a blob of cells, and so no murder is really taking place. So the debate isn't, is it wrong to murder babies? The debate is abortion really murder? In the case of Indians considering the killing of cows immoral, Indians' belief that cows should not be killed is shaped by their religious belief in reincarnation. They believe that the souls of their loved ones could be inhabiting the cows in the pasture. We Americans don't believe that. But since Indians do believe that, to eat a cow is potential cannibalism. But since we Americans don't believe that, we have no qualms about eating cows. We don't believe that the souls of our loved ones could have come back in the form of a cow. We both agree that it is morally wrong to eat your relatives. What we disagree on is whether our relatives can come back as cows. Objection 2. What if you needed to lie in order to save someone's life? Wouldn't that imply that morality isn't really absolute? The problem with this objection is that we're not talking about moral absolutes. We're talking about objective morality. We need to keep in mind that there is a difference between an absolute, a moral absolute, and an objective moral fact. For something to be immoral in an absolute sense means that it must always be wrong in every single situation, no matter what, no exceptions whatsoever. By contrast, for something to be objectively immoral, it just has to be immoral due to the fact that it's immoral regardless of what anyone may think about it. Objectivity is mind independent or judgment independent. When I argue for objective morality, I'm not arguing that it is, for example, always the case that lying is wrong, or that it's always the case that killing another person is wrong. It may be, in some cases, that lying is justified. For example, if Nazis came to your door and asked if you were hiding Jews, your obligation to defend human life, innocent human life, would supersede your obligation to state an accurate proposition. The moral argument does not defend absolute morality, or at least the one that I'm running. Rather, it contends that certain things are objectively right or wrong. In the case of lying to the Nazis, it would be objectively right in that situation to lie. But in many other situations, for example, if you were lying out of personal gain, or if you were lying to cheat someone out of their money, it would be objectively wrong to lie in those circumstances. In the case of killing, it is objectively wrong to kill someone for no reason. But it might be objectively right to kill someone who is about to kill your whole family. In other words, self-defense. Self-defense can be objectively right. It's noteworthy that these moral dilemmas cause such conflict in our minds because we really believe in the objectivity of the moral status of the actions in question. We believe lying is objectively bad, and we also believe that doing anything that would send innocent people to their deaths is objectively bad. Objection 3. Doesn't the socio-biological evolutionary account undermine the reliability of our moral intuitions? Many people think that our moral beliefs are spin-offs of biological and social evolution and conditioning. Our moral beliefs were chosen by natural selection because they benefit the continued existence of the human species. The objector here argues that the socio-biological account of the origins of morality discredits our moral intuition. But is this a valid argument? I don't think so. First of all, this objection commits the genetic fallacy. What is the genetic fallacy? The genetic fallacy is committed when someone tries to discredit a belief by showing how someone came to hold that belief. For example, I've heard many atheists say, "You're only a Christian because you were raised in a Christian home. If you were raised in a Muslim home, you'd be a Muslim. If you were raised in a Buddhist home, you'd be a Buddhist." This argument is fallacious because how I came to believe Christianity is true is entirely irrelevant to whether or not it is true. You could have learned your moral duties from a questionable source, but you could still be correct in what you believe constitutes your moral duties. Bad epistemology does not result in a false ontology. However, the objector might back up and go, "Okay, dude, maybe the truth isn't undermined by evolutionary theory, but the epistemological justification is undermined." The socio-biological account might not logically entail that objective moral values and duties don't really exist, but it would prevent us from having knowledge of moral facts. Knowledge here I'm defining as justified true belief. After all, natural selection selects things for their survival value, not for their truth value. First of all, this protestation to the argument is self-refuting, because not only our moral beliefs are formed through socio-biological conditioning, but every single one of our beliefs are, such that you couldn't believe anything, not even the socio-biological account. Secondly, this objection presupposes a non-theistic evolution. If evolution is true, but it's God-guided, then our moral intuitions could still be reliable, because God could either inscribe the moral law onto our hearts, as Romans chapter 2 says, or he could guide the evolutionary processes to produce true moral beliefs. In other words, the objector needs to prove that atheism is true in order for this objection to get off the ground. Objection 4. Your beliefs about morality are simply emotional reactions to what you like and dislike. An agnostic who frequents the Cerebral Faith Facebook page and also the blog, and we've had many discussions, many debates on a variety of different topics. It's always an enjoyable time. He argued in the comment section of one of my blog posts that our moral intuitions about right and wrong are just emotionally charged reactions to different behaviors. He pointed out that when Frank Turek presents the moral argument, he shows pictures of bodies of Holocaust victims piled up on top of one another, and he then says something along the lines of, if there is no God, then this wasn't really wrong, it's just a matter of opinion. Why does Frank Turek do that? Because, my agnostic friend says, it's emotionally powerful. And emotions evoke this instinct or intuition, which is highly connected to these types of emotions. My agnostic friend said, and this is an actual quote taken from our conversation, that, quote, if he said that if there is no God, then being rude isn't really wrong, it's just a matter of opinion, that wouldn't impress anyone, since it would have none of the emotional power. Thus, observation clearly shows that morality is an instinct that gets its power from emotion. Accept or deny moral realism, the basic principles of morality are derived from emotionally charged instincts. End quote. There are several things I can think of that I believe to be morally wrong, and yet, when people do them, I don't get hot under the collar over it. This shows that moral knowledge is not reducible to feelings. C.S. Lewis addressed the argument this way. In his book Mere Christianity, he wrote,
"Isn't what you call the moral law simply our herd instinct, and hasn't it been developed just like all our other instincts? Now, I do not deny that we may have a herd instinct, but that is not what I meant by the moral law. We all know what it feels like to be prompted by instinct, by mother love, or sexual instinct, or the instinct for food. It means that you feel a strong want or desire to act in a certain way. And, of course, we sometimes do feel just that sort of desire to help another person, and no doubt that desire is due to the herd instinct. But feeling a desire to help is quite different from feeling that you ought to help, whether you want to or not. Supposing you hear a cry for help from a man in danger, you will probably feel two desires. One, a desire to give help, due to your herd instinct, the other a desire to keep out of danger, due to the instinct for self-preservation. But you will find inside you, in addition to these two impulses, a third thing which tells you that you ought to follow the impulse to help and suppress the impulse to run away. Now this thing that judges between two instincts, that decides which should be encouraged, cannot itself be either of them. You might as well say that the sheet of music which tells you at a given moment to play one note on the piano and not another is itself one of the notes on the keyboard. The moral law tells us the tune we have to play. Our instincts are merely the key.
So taking Lewis's 3 instincts model, let's devise a little thought experiment. Let us suppose that someone does something really evil to me, like murder my entire family. I have a strong emotional reaction of hatred and a desire for revenge. I also have a feeling of horror that evil thoughts of vengeance would enter my mind. But there's a third thing within me that tells me which emotion is evil and should be suppressed. That third thing cannot be either of them. That third thing tells me that fantasies of getting even are wrong and I shouldn't even have them. That third thing does not tell me that abhorrence at vengeful thoughts are wrong. The third thing is the moral knowledge that revenge is not the way, that 2 wrongs don't make a right, and so on. The third thing is not, in itself, an emotional reaction at all. So then, once again, we see that moral knowledge and beliefs cannot be reduced to emotional reactions. Finally, I think the reason that Frank Turek presents the Holocaust as an example, rather than an example of someone being rude, is that it's the most obvious example of evil that you could think of. You'd sound like a monster if you just bit the bullet and said, nah, that's not really wrong, it's just something I don't like. I think Frank Turek very well could use rudeness as an example if he wanted to, but it would most likely work better in a one-on-one conversation rather than in an apologetics lecture. For example, let's say that Frank had this hypothetical discussion. Frank, God is obviously real. There'd be no morality without him. If you can't see that, then you've got poop for brains. Atheist. Hey, that's not very nice. I'm trying my best to figure out the truth about reality. I just don't find your arguments for moral realism convincing. Frank. You don't find them convincing because you're an idiot. Atheist. Stop it. I have a PhD in philosophy. I'm just as intelligent as you are. Frank. Why should I stop? Are you saying it's objectively wrong for me to insult you? Atheist. Well, no, I just don't care for it. Frank, well, why should I cater to your personal tastes, moron? Atheist, alright, it's objectively wrong. Now will you stop calling me stupid? Frank, sure thing. To conclude, I don't think that moral intuition is reducible to emotional reactions or like or dislike. Our moral knowledge is present whether our emotions are or not. Objection 5. Intuitions are notoriously unreliable. The same agnostic friend who brought up the previous objection brought up this one as well, and in the same conversation. He argued that intuitions are notoriously unreliable sources of knowledge, and so many of our intuitions on a variety of different topics have been discredited time after time. Given that makes it unlikely that our intuitions about morality can be trusted. Or to put it in his own words, quote, "It, the objection, is about the point that when a category of alleged means of attaining knowledge is discredited, you don't need to discredit all specific examples of it. Thus, our instincts about reality being unreliable in general discredits moral instincts as a way of knowing about the way the world works." End quote. You can't just say, see, we had intuitions about A, B, and C, and they were wrong. Your intuition about D is probably wrong too. Therefore, we can't say that for sure that D is real. That's fallacious. Let A stand for the intuition that it's the sun that moves rather than the earth. B stands for the earth being flat, and C stands for heavier objects falling faster than lighter objects. All of these intuitions have been falsified through scientific evidence. Intuitions A, B, and C had defeaters to them. Scientists proved that heavy objects and light objects fall at exactly the same rate, rather than heavier objects falling faster than lighter objects. But you cannot use disproven intuitions to disprove other intuitions. It's like saying that because some scientific theories have been disproven, that therefore we ought not believe that the theory of evolution is true. The very fact that science, logic, religion, and intuition have many examples of falsified truth claims cannot be used as an argument that science, logic, religion, and intuition are not valid pathways to knowledge. Each truth claim must be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, and only when a particular claim is invalidated by particular evidence can we say that that claim is false, that intuition was faulty, that intuition is not true. In this case, in the particular case of moral intuition, why should I distrust my moral intuition? Why should I distrust my intuition that tells me that objective moral values and duties exist? Unless you can give some good evidence to show that this intuition is wrong, why should I trust this intuition any more than I trust my intuition that my 5 physical senses are giving me reliable and true information about the physical world? The fact that I could be having a dream right now doesn't mean that I am. The very fact that my moral intuition could be false doesn't mean that it is. You've got to give some evidence against it. In conclusion, we have many good reasons to believe that the second premise of the moral argument is true, and we have no good reasons to believe that the second premise is false. So given that both premise 1 and premise 2 of the moral argument are true, we've got good reasons to believe both premises are true, and we've got no good reasons to believe that either of the premises are false, then we should be confident that both premises are true, and therefore the conclusion is true, therefore God exists. Well guys, I hope you liked this video series, this 2-part video series on the moral argument. If you liked it, hit the like button. Please subscribe. Check out cerebralfaith.net for other apologetic resources. And if you would, consider becoming a patron at www.patreon.com/cerebralfaith. And until next time, keep using the brains that God gave you.